Is it okay for a pastor to dye their hair blue? I hope that most of you listening to this video hear that and go, yeah, why wouldn't it be? Because that was kind of my first reaction as well, until I saw a poll from a Christian channel that I follow that I highly recommend. They're called Ready to Harvest, and they explain the beliefs of different denominations, compare different denominations and different theological stances. They're terrifically unbiased, and they host these polls regularly and just to see what their followers think. And I thought, of course, like 80%, 90% of Christians will say, yeah, of course it's fine for clergy to dye their hair whatever color they want. And boy, was I wrong. So let's talk a little bit about that question today. Is it okay for pastors to dye their hair? Before we get too far into it, please like, comment, share, and subscribe if our content is helpful to you. We are really close to getting to 100 subscribers, and if we can just break that barrier, then it will really help us out in the algorithms, and I think it gives us some extra tools when we're making our videos on YouTube as well. So thank you so much. Let's get into it. So I was laying in bed scrolling on my phone as one is wont to do, and I saw one of these polls from this channel, Ready to Harvest, which again, I highly recommend. They're awesome. They're very unbiased. I think it's really just a one-man show over there, but it's a terrific channel. And this poll, the question was, is it okay for a pastor to dye their hair blue? And the options were yes, sometimes yes, no, not sure, and they always add the option just show results, which I really appreciate. I clicked yes because I think this is blatantly obvious. Of course it's okay. And I thought the vast majority of Christians, there'll be a few curmudgeons out there that say no, but the vast majority will say yes or sometimes yes. 56% of people said no. It is not appropriate for a priest or senior pastor or similar office in your church tradition to dye their hair blue. Why? I have some theories on why, but first of all, I want to point out why this bothers me so much. There are people, including on the comments on this poll, that are laughing at us because this is just ridiculous. Now, hold on. If you're one of those people who said, no, that's not appropriate, let's just think about this for a moment before you turn this video off. If we have a question, especially when it comes to church life, about how Christians or Christian ministers specifically should behave, our answers should come from Scripture. We should immediately ask, does the Bible speak of this issue? Now, I think most of us wouldn't expect the Bible to directly speak about dyeing someone's hair. That was a practice in the ancient world. There were ways that people could dye their hair various colors, but it wasn't near as commonplace as it is today. But still, the Scriptures do speak a little bit about hair. Now, specifically, we want to look at the New Testament because we are Christians, and while there are certainly many commandments in the Old Testament that still apply, commandments that are specific to the Mosaic covenant do not. So we want to look in the New Testament. Are there any commandments given to Christians, whether they're reaffirmed commandments from the Old Covenant, or whether they are new commandments entirely? Are there any commandments or instructions or stories that we can look to that can give us some input on this? So are there passages in the New Testament that speak about hair? Actually, there are. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 speaks pretty extensively about prayer. Now, this chapter is about rules when it comes to prayer and prophecy in public worship. And two of the verses in this passage, or 2.5 actually, verses 6 and 14 and half of verse 15, say this about women's and men's hair specifically. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have all her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace to a woman to have her hair cut off and her head shaved, then she should cover her head. And then in verse 14, does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? This is a really interesting and kind of weird passage. There's a number of Christian groups that still have women wear head coverings in public worship, but the majority of us don't. Moreover, we don't demand that men have short hair, and we don't demand that women have long hair. My wife had a rather short haircut for the first couple months of our marriage. We have a guy who serves here and even preaches sometimes for us that has very long hair. So why is it that we, and most Christian traditions, don't insist on this rule anymore? And the answer is culture. The only people that the Romans would have been familiar with that would have had long hair would have been barbarians, or at least whose men would have had long hair, would have been barbarians, Germanic tribes that they were constantly at war with and were fearful of. It is important to the Christians to fit into the culture that they are living in, at least in areas where there's no explicit commandment. So Paul is writing this church in Corinth, which is having issues in a lot of areas with basically saying, well, we are in Christ, therefore we are free and we can do whatever we want. And they're causing a lot of trouble in the church, outside of the church, just generally with everyone around them. These would not be good neighbors, these people in the Corinthian church. And so as Paul writes to them, he says, hey, look, doesn't the very nature of things, doesn't all the examples you see around you in Greco-Roman society teach you that men should have short hair? This is a cultural tradition of theirs, which obviously gets thrown out the window just a couple hundred years later when long hair begins being associated with nobility and with kingship. And Jesus is depicted as having long hair in European art. And there's an entire dynasty of kings called the Carolingians that literally their name, the Carolingians, translates to the long-haired ones. It's a cultural issue that men should not have long hair in the Greco-Roman Empire, or the Greco-Roman society, Greco-Roman culture. As for women having short hair, the only women that would have had short, cropped, or even shaved hair would have been priestesses, often in fertility cults, and prostitutes. And there's actually overlap there. Usually a priestess in a fertility cult would have been, like Artemis of the Ephesians, would have been a prostitute, a temple prostitute as well, because sex was a very important part of the way that fertility gods were worshipped. And so Paul's getting after these people and saying, look, your women are dressing up like prostitutes and your men are dressing up like barbarians, and people are starting to think that you Christians think prostitution and violent war against the Roman Empire are both okay, and that's not really what we teach here. Do you see the context? Now, regardless of this particular issue, there are still passages of the Bible that do certainly apply. Let's look at one of them, specifically a passage about food sacrificed to idols. In the very same book that we just read a passage from, 1 Corinthians, Paul writes about food sacrificed to idols. It was common practice in the society that the Corinthians were living in for food to be dedicated to a deity, some of it to be sacrificed to that deity, and the rest of the meat from the same animal that has been dedicated to then be sold in the markets or offered at dinner to guests or what have you. There were sometimes massive festivals that people could take part in where there was free or very cheap food, especially meat, that normal people would not be able to afford. But because it was a festival day, there was large amounts of it available, and it was either free or very, very cheap at the expense of the local temple. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul is addressing a question that he either has been asked or simply knows troubles this church. Is it okay for Christians to eat meat that has been dedicated to a pagan god? And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 27, he says this: if an unbeliever invites you to go to a meal and you want to go, then eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, this food has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I am referring to the other person's conscience and not to yours. For why is my freedom judged by another person's conscience? So the situation that Paul describes here is you're invited to dinner by presumably a pagan, and they put meat in front of you. And he says, if they don't offer, don't ask. Don't say, hey, has this meat been sacrificed to idols? Just eat what's put in front of you. That meat itself does not pose a danger to you. But if they tell you, hey, this meat has been sacrificed to Artemis, this meat has been dedicated to Zeus, then you shouldn't eat it. But he's very specific. This is not for your conscience. In other words, it would not be a sin per se for you to eat it, at least not a sin against yourself. The reason why you shouldn't eat it is for the sake of the conscience of the other person. Because if they tell you, hey, this meat's been dedicated to Zeus, and then you eat it, they might think, oh, well, Christians are okay with worshiping Zeus. Or if there's another Christian at the table with you, they might see you and say, but does that mean that you're okay with worshiping Zeus? And you might actually cause someone else to have bad ideas of what Christianity is. You may even trick someone into sinning thinking that it's okay. Thinking, oh, well, since they ate that meat that they knew was sacrificed to Zeus, that must mean it's okay to sacrifice animals to Zeus. You see how they'd make that logical leap. So Paul's not saying it's sinful in and of itself to eat meat sacrificed to idols, but he's saying you should be careful to only do things that you know will not cause others to fall into doubt or to fall into sin. He actually elaborates on this a little bit further earlier in the same chapter, chapter 10, verses 20 through 22. He explains that there are certain situations where maybe it is a sin to eat meat that you know has been sacrificed to an idol, even if it's not going to cause a crisis of conscience for someone else. He says the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons and not to God. That's controversial in today's day and age, but this is Paul's belief, and I think that it's valid. Some of these idols that were being worshipped weren't just inanimate objects. I mean, they were to some extent, but the spirits behind them may even be demons in some case. And this is a common concern throughout the New Testament during conversations about idols. The sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord. He's talking about communion here. You can't drink the cup of the Lord and drink the cup of demons as well. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Are we stronger than He? So Paul's clearly concerned that at least in some situations, eating meat that has been sacrificed to an idol may not be permissible because it is an act of worship. And I think here he's probably talking about those festivals that are dedicated to a certain deity. If there is a festival to Zeus and there's free beef being given away in the town agora, you should not go and eat it because that festival and participating in the festival is an act of worship. We actually know from early Christian writers that Christians refused to attend pagan festivals, things like Saturnalia, these very famous pagan festivals. Now, eventually, many of these festivals, Christians actually made their own versions of them. That's where we get holidays like Christmas from. Jesus quite certainly was not born in December. We aren't entirely sure exactly when he was born, when in the year he was born. But we took a pagan holiday and said, well, we need a time to celebrate Jesus being born, and we just kind of stole the holiday and made it about Jesus instead of making it about a foreign pagan deity. So this was common practice for Christians for centuries, that they wouldn't participate in pagan holidays, and instead they'd make their own Christian alternatives, which is where we get most of the holidays that even secular people in the United States celebrate today. Paul is concerned that participation in these festivals or possibly other situations that are explicitly religious, where if you eat meat sacrificed to a pagan deity, you might actually be performing an act of worship towards a false god, maybe even displaying fealty unknowingly to a demonic force. So in those situations, you should not eat meat sacrificed to idols. Now, what does this have to do with the color of your hair? You could argue that Paul asserts that if your actions disturb another Christian, then you shouldn't do them. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I apologize, there's a typo on the slide. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 32 through 33, you might point to these verses. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews or Greeks or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. And I've heard people point to this verse to say all sorts of things that Christians can't do that are not forbidden in the scriptures. You shouldn't dye your hair. You shouldn't get tattoos, even though they'll admit that tattoos are indeed permissible because we are no longer under the old covenant, which seems to forbid them. But they'll say, but you still shouldn't, because you'll disturb some of the people in the church. There's some of those old people in the church that think that tattoos are not okay. You'll disturb some. You'll cause them to stumble. But we have to ask the question, what does stumbling mean? And in this context, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when Jesus talks about making one of the little ones stumble, they're talking about something that will lead someone else into sin. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32 does not say, do not cause anyone to have hurt feelings. It does not say, do not publicly disagree with anyone. That's not what it says. It says, do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews or Greeks or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. And that's the purpose statement. Why do you not want to cause anyone to stumble? Why do you not want to lead anyone into sin? So that many people may be saved. The ethos here, the reason why we're doing the things that we're doing, the reason why in many situations Christians should not eat meat sacrificed to idols in the city of Corinth in the 1st century AD is because that action, eating meat sacrificed to idols, may cause other people to sin, to misunderstand Christianity, or maybe even to never serve or reject Jesus. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. So what does this have to do with blue hair again? The answer to that is really simple. Just like with meat sacrificed to idols, whenever we run into a situation that is not explicitly forbidden in Scripture, and there's no clear theological positions or principles or doctrines that would forbid something to Christians, when we're asking, am I allowed to do this or not, we should ask the question, is it going to cause my brother or sister or someone outside the church to reject Jesus or sin against him? And if the answer is no, then you can do it. And people may argue that, well, you're going to hurt someone's feelings because they think that a pastor should dress a certain way. But hurting someone's feelings or ticking someone off because you're not doing things the way they want you to do them is not the same as making someone stumble. So despite what 56% of people on Ready to Harvest's channel would say, despite what all of the church curmudgeons of the world might say, at least in the vast majority of situations, blue hair is fine. There is nothing in the Bible that forbids it. And let me make something very explicit. If the concern is driving people away from Jesus, that we should not do things that may push people away from God, what's going to cause more harm? Being the kind of person that wants to deny the normal human life of your clergy, to say, hey, here's all these things that normal people can do, but you're not allowed to. Even though it's not forbidden in the scriptures, but you're not allowed to because I don't want you to. If you're going to be that kind of person, if you're going to make up ridiculous extra biblical rules for your elders and your preachers and for whoever else to follow, who's causing more harm to the kingdom? The person with blue hair or you? I think that answer is pretty clear.